Picture this. It's 1660 and Japan is literally tearing itself apart. The entire country has become a battlefield where hundreds of warrior clans are fighting for control, each one dreaming of becoming the supreme ruler. It's called the Sengoku period, which means warring states, and honestly that name couldn't be more accurate. In the middle of all this chaos stands a young man who's about to change everything. His name is Oda Nobunaga, and at just 26 years old, most people think he's completely insane. While other warlords stick to traditional samurai tactics that have been used for centuries, Nobunaga is doing something revolutionary. He's embracing new technology, specifically these Portuguese firearms called arquebuses that most samurai consider dishonorable weapons. But here's what makes Nobunaga truly different from everyone else. He doesn't just think outside the box, he completely ignores the box exists. While his rivals are playing by ancient rules of honor and tradition, he's rewriting the entire game. He uses psychological warfare, employing war drums and even animal sounds to confuse and terrify his enemies. Imagine being a samurai, hearing what sounds like wild beasts charging at you through the fog of battle. The fascinating thing about this period is that Japan had been unified before, but that unity had completely collapsed. Now every province, every valley, every mountain pass had its own little king who thought he could conquer the whole country. It was like a massive, deadly chess game where everyone believed they were destined to be the winner. What most people don't realize is that Nobunaga wasn't born into power like many of his rivals. He had to fight for every inch of territory, every loyal follower, every small victory. His unconventional methods weren't just tactical choices, they were survival strategies. In a world where playing by the rules meant certain defeat, he chose to create his own rules entirely. This wasn't just about military conquest, though. Nobunaga understood something that many of his contemporaries missed. The old feudal system was dying, and whoever could adapt to the changing times would ultimately rule Japan. While others clung to the past, he was already building the future. Imagine waking up every morning not knowing if your neighbor might decide to invade your land before lunch. That was life in 16th century Japan during what historians call the Sengoku period, and it was absolute madness. The country that we know today as unified Japan simply didn't exist back then. Instead, it was a patchwork of hundreds of rival clans, each controlling their own little piece of territory, and each convinced they were destined to rule the entire nation. Picture this chaos. Every mountain pass had its own warlord, every fertile valley was contested by multiple clans, and alliances shifted faster than the weather. One day you might be allies with the clan next door, and the next day they could be burning down your villages. It was like a massive, deadly game of chess where everyone thought they were the rightful king. Into this world of constant warfare stepped Oda Nobunaga, and from the very beginning people thought he was completely out of his mind. While other samurai lords were following battle strategies that had been passed down for generations, Nobunaga was doing things that made the old guard shake their heads in disgust. He wasn't just breaking tradition, he was shattering it into 1,000 pieces. Here's where it gets really interesting. While his rivals were still fighting with traditional weapons and formations that their grandfathers had used, Nobunaga was embracing something revolutionary. Portuguese traders had recently brought firearms called arquebuses to Japan, and most samurai considered these weapons beneath their honor. They believed that true warriors fought with swords, face to face, in honorable combat. But Nobunaga, he saw the future staring him in the face and grabbed it with both hands. The tension between old and new was incredible. On one side, you had centuries of samurai tradition that emphasized personal honor, individual combat, and rigid social hierarchies. On the other side, you had Nobunaga saying, forget all that, let's win battles instead. He trained peasants to use firearms, organized rapid cavalry charges, and completely ignored the ancient rules of warfare that everyone else considered sacred. But here's the most fascinating part. Nobunaga understood that war wasn't just about weapons and tactics, it was about psychology. He would have his troops beat war drums in specific rhythms that would echo off mountains and valleys, creating an almost supernatural sound that could be heard for miles. Sometimes his soldiers would make animal noises, howling like wolves or screeching like birds of prey, which would absolutely terrify enemy forces who had never encountered anything like it. Think about being a traditional samurai, trained from childhood to expect certain sounds and patterns in battle. suddenly hearing what seemed like demons or wild beasts charging through the mist. It wasn't just warfare, it was psychological torture, and it worked brilliantly. While other commanders were focused on sword techniques and cavalry formations, Nobunaga was studying how to break his enemies' minds before the actual fighting even began. This wasn't just about being different for the sake of being different. Nobunaga recognized that the old ways weren't working anymore. Japan had been locked in this endless cycle of warfare for decades, and traditional methods had only led to more chaos. Someone had to break the pattern, and he decided that someone would be him, even if it meant being called a madman by everyone around him. Now, if Nobunaga was considered the wild card of Japanese warfare, then Imagawa Yoshimoto was the absolute opposite. This man was everything that traditional samurai society respected: wealthy, powerful, cultured, and commanding respect from every corner of Japan. Yoshimoto wasn't just another warlord, he was the warlord that everyone feared and admired at the same time. Picture this giant of a man, not just physically, but politically. Yoshimoto controlled some of the richest provinces in Japan, and his family had been major players in Japanese politics for generations. He had something that most other warlords could only dream of: legitimacy. While guys like Nobunaga were scrapping for every bit of territory they could get, Yoshimoto had inherited a powerhouse that had been built over centuries. In the spring of 1560, Yoshimoto decided it was time to make his ultimate move. He assembled an army that was absolutely massive for those times: 25,000 men, all well-equipped, well-trained, and completely loyal to him. This wasn't just any army. This was the cream of the crop: elite samurai, experienced foot soldiers, cavalry units, the works. When this force started marching toward Kyoto, the ancient capital of Japan, people knew something huge was about to happen. Kyoto wasn't just any city, it was the heart of Japanese culture and politics. Whoever controlled Kyoto could claim to rule all of Japan. So when Yoshimoto began his march with this incredible force, it sent shockwaves throughout the country. Everyone understood what this meant. He was making his bid to become the supreme ruler of all Japan. And then there was Nobunaga, sitting in his modest territory with exactly 3,000 soldiers. Just think about those numbers for a second. 25,000 versus 3,000. That's more than 8 times larger. It would be like bringing a pocket knife to a cannon fight. Every single advisor, every ally, every person with half a brain was telling Nobunaga the same thing: run, hide, live to fight another day. This is where the story gets really human, because Nobunaga faced a choice that would define not just his own fate, but the entire future of Japan. He could do what any reasonable person would do, which was to avoid this massive army, maybe retreat to his strongest fortress, wait for Yoshimoto to pass by, and hope to survive long enough to try again later. It was the smart choice, the safe choice, the choice that would keep him alive. But here's what made Nobunaga different from every other warlord of his time. He didn't think like everyone else. While his advisors were calculating odds and suggesting retreat routes, he was seeing something completely different. He was seeing opportunity where everyone else saw certain death. The moral weight of this decision was enormous. If he chose to fight and lost, it wouldn't just be his own life at stake. Those 3,000 soldiers who had chosen to follow him would die too. Their families would be left without fathers, sons, and brothers. His territory would be conquered. His people would suffer under new rulers, and everything he had worked for would be destroyed. But if he ran, if he chose the safe path, what kind of leader would that make him? How could he ever inspire loyalty again if he backed down from the biggest challenge of his life? And more importantly, how could he live with himself knowing that he had given up the chance to change Japan forever? So Nobunaga made a choice that shocked everyone around him. He looked at those impossible odds, at that massive army approaching his lands, and he said something that his generals would remember for the rest of their lives: "We fight." It wasn't bravado, it wasn't madness, though many people thought it was both. It was a calculated gamble by a man who understood that sometimes the biggest risks offer the greatest rewards. Yoshimoto's army was powerful, yes, but it was also confident to the point of arrogance. And confident armies sometimes make mistakes that clever underdogs can exploit. The stage was set for one of the most incredible battles in Japanese history, where everything would depend not on the size of the army, but on the brilliance of the strategy. What happened next is the kind of strategy that military historians still study today, because it was so audacious, so perfectly timed, and so completely unexpected that it almost seems like fiction. But this is real history, and Nobunaga was about to pull off one of the most brilliant deceptions in the history of warfare. Here's how it unfolded. As Yoshimoto's massive army approached, Nobunaga did something that made even his own soldiers question his sanity. He ordered a full retreat, but this wasn't just any retreat, it was theater at its finest. His men abandoned their camp in what appeared to be complete panic, leaving behind everything that would suggest they had fled in terror. And here's the genius part. They left behind a feast. Picture this scene, tables loaded with food, sake bottles still warm, cooking fires still burning, as if the soldiers had been in the middle of celebrating when scouts brought news of the approaching army, and they all ran for their lives. It was the perfect bait, and Yoshimoto's forces took it completely. When the Imagawa army reached Nobunaga's abandoned camp, they couldn't believe their luck. Here was this incredible spread of food and drink, just sitting there waiting for them. After days of marching, carrying heavy equipment, and dealing with the stress of an impending battle, this seemed like a gift from the gods. The discipline that had kept this massive army organized began to crumble as soldiers started helping themselves to the abandoned feast. This is where human nature played right into Nobunaga's hands. These weren't just hungry soldiers, they were confident soldiers. They believed they had already won. In their minds, Nobunaga had proven he was a coward by running away, and now they could celebrate their victory before the real fighting even began. The sake flowed freely, and what started as a quick meal turned into a full celebration. But Nobunaga hadn't gone far. While his enemies were getting drunk on his food and wine, he was positioning his 3,000 men in the hills around the valley, watching and waiting for the perfect moment. And then nature itself seemed to join his cause. A massive storm rolled in, the kind of typhoon that Japan is famous for, with winds so strong they could knock a man off his feet, and rain so heavy you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. Most commanders would have seen this as a disaster, something that would make fighting impossible, but Nobunaga saw it as the perfect cover. While Yoshimoto's soldiers huddled in their tents, trying to stay dry and probably nursing hangovers from their impromptu celebration, Nobunaga's forces moved through the storm like ghosts. They used the howling wind and driving rain as camouflage, getting impossibly close to the enemy camp without being detected. What happened next was over in minutes, but those minutes changed the course of Japanese history forever. Nobunaga's arquebusiers, those soldiers with the Portuguese firearms that traditional samurai despised, emerged from the storm like avenging spirits and opened fire at point-blank range. The sound of gunshots mixed with thunder created a nightmare scenario for Yoshimoto's forces, who were caught completely off guard. In the chaos and confusion, with rain making it impossible to see clearly and the storm masking all sound, Nobunaga's men struck directly at the heart of the enemy force. They knew exactly where to find Yoshimoto because they had been watching the camp, and they went straight for him. Imagawa Yoshimoto, the man who had seemed unstoppable just hours before, died in those first moments of the attack. Some accounts say he was shot by an arquebus. Others say he was cut down by a sword, but the result was the same. The giant had fallen, and when his head was severed and raised on a spear, visible even through the storm, his entire army knew their cause was lost. Think about the psychological impact of this moment. 1 second you're part of an unstoppable force, led by one of Japan's most powerful warlords, and the next second that leader is dead, and you're surrounded by enemies who appeared out of nowhere like demons in the storm. The panic was immediate and complete. What makes this victory even more incredible is how close Nobunaga came to disaster. Legend has it that there was a crucial moment when his own forces almost attacked each other in the confusion of the storm, and only quick thinking by his officers prevented his entire plan from falling apart due to a simple communication error. But when the storm cleared and the sun came out, the impossible had happened. Nobunaga, with his tiny force of 3,000, had completely destroyed an army of 25,000. It wasn't just a victory. It was a statement to all of Japan that the old rules no longer applied, and that genius could triumph over overwhelming odds. Did you know that Nobunaga almost lost everything because of a communication mix-up in the middle of that storm? If you're enjoying this incredible story of one of history's most brilliant military victories, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles so you never miss these amazing historical tales. And tell me in the comments, would you have had the courage to face an army 8 times larger than yours? The morning after Okehazama, Japan, woke up to a completely different world. News of Nobunaga's impossible victory spread like wildfire across the country, and with each telling, the story became more incredible. A young warlord with 3,000 men had just destroyed the most powerful army in the region. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know, who exactly was this Oda Nobunaga? What's fascinating is how quickly everything changed. Before Okehazama, Nobunaga was just another minor lord that most people had barely heard of. Sure, he had a reputation for being unconventional, maybe even crazy, but he wasn't considered a major player in the grand scheme of Japanese politics. After Okehazama, he became something else entirely. He became a legend. Think about the psychology of what happened next. All across Japan, smaller clans and minor warlords who had been struggling to survive in this chaotic period suddenly saw a new possibility. Here was someone who had proven that the old giants could be toppled, that clever strategy could overcome overwhelming force, and that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to accept the status quo anymore. The domino effect was immediate and dramatic. Clans that had never considered allying with Nobunaga before started sending messengers to his court. Some came out of genuine admiration for his tactical brilliance. Others came because they were terrified of what might happen if they didn't join him while they still could. But they all came, and with each new alliance, Nobunaga's power grew exponentially. Here's what makes this moment so crucial in Japanese history. Without the Battle of Okehazama, Japan might have remained fractured for centuries longer. Before this victory, there was no clear path to unification. The major powers were too evenly matched, too set in their traditional ways, and too focused on small-scale territorial disputes to imagine a truly unified Japan. But Nobunaga's victory proved that dramatic change was possible, and more importantly, it gave him the credibility and resources to actually pursue that change. Suddenly, unification wasn't just a dream, it was a realistic goal with a leader capable of achieving it. What Nobunaga did next was even more revolutionary than his military tactics. While other successful warlords might have simply expanded their territory and continued playing by the same feudal rules, Nobunaga decided to completely rewrite how Japanese society worked. He started breaking down the rigid class system that had defined Japan for centuries. Traditional feudalism said that peasants farmed, samurai fought, and merchants were barely above beggars in terms of social status. Nobunaga threw all of that out the window. He promoted people based on ability rather than birth. He encouraged trade and commerce, and he actively sought out new technologies from foreign countries. This wasn't just about being progressive for the sake of it. Nobunaga understood something that many of his contemporaries missed. Economic power was just as important as military power, maybe even more so. A wealthy, technologically advanced society could support larger armies, better weapons, and more effective administration than a traditional feudal system ever could. He established free markets in his territories, breaking the monopolies that had been controlled by religious institutions and traditional merchant guilds for generations. Imagine being a small trader who had always been forced to pay tribute to multiple overlords just to move your goods from one town to another, and suddenly, Nobunaga declares that trade should be free and open to everyone. It was revolutionary. The religious institutions felt this change most dramatically. For centuries, Buddhist monasteries had been major political and economic powers in Japan, controlling vast lands and even maintaining their own armies. Nobunaga saw them as obstacles to his vision of a unified, modernized Japan, and he dealt with them accordingly. This wasn't just about religious differences, it was about breaking the power of institutions that represented the old, fragmented way of doing things. But perhaps most importantly, Nobunaga embraced foreign technology and ideas at a time when most Japanese leaders were suspicious of outside influence. Those Portuguese firearms that had helped him win at Okehazama were just the beginning. He welcomed European missionaries, not necessarily because he was interested in Christianity, but because they brought knowledge of engineering, mathematics, and military technology that could help modernize Japan. The ripple effects of these changes were enormous. Cities in Nobunaga's territory began to grow rapidly as trade flourished. Technological innovation accelerated, as he encouraged experimentation and rewarded results rather than tradition. The whole social fabric of Japanese society began to shift toward something that looked much more like the modern world. What's really remarkable is how quickly this transformation happened. Within just a few years of Okehazama, regions under Nobunaga's control were becoming noticeably more prosperous, more technologically advanced, and more efficiently governed than their neighbors. This created another kind of domino effect, as people in other territories began to wonder why they couldn't have the same benefits. The Battle of Okehazama had done more than just eliminate a rival. It had opened the door to a completely new vision of what Japan could become. And Nobunaga, the young man who had been willing to risk everything on one desperate gamble, was now in a position to make that vision a reality. But here's where our story takes a much darker turn, because every great historical figure has shadows, and Nobunaga's shadows were particularly long and dark. The same man who brought innovation and progress to Japan also earned a nickname that still sends chills down people's spines: the demon of the 16th century. To understand why people called him this, we need to talk about what happened when Nobunaga's vision of a unified modern Japan came into conflict with institutions that had been powerful for centuries. The Buddhist monasteries weren't just religious centers, they were political and military powerhouses that controlled vast territories and commanded armies of warrior monks who were just as skilled in battle as any samurai. These warrior monks, known as Sohei, had been a force in Japanese politics for hundreds of years. They weren't just spiritual leaders, they were armed militants who could make or break political alliances. Many of them saw Nobunaga's reforms as a direct threat to everything they believed in, not just religiously but politically and economically as well. The conflict came to a head at Mount Hiei, home to one of Japan's most sacred and powerful Buddhist complexes. This wasn't just any monastery, it was practically a fortified city that had been challenging imperial authority for generations. When the monks there decided to oppose Nobunaga's unification efforts, he made a decision that shocked even his own allies. In 1571, Nobunaga surrounded Mount Hiei with his forces and gave the monks an ultimatum: surrender or face complete destruction. When they refused, he did something that was almost unthinkable at the time. He ordered his troops to burn the entire complex to the ground, and not just the buildings, but to kill everyone inside, including monks who had never held a weapon in their lives. The scale of what happened was staggering. Thousands of people died, including children who had been studying at the monastery schools. Ancient temples that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash. Sacred texts and artworks that represented irreplaceable pieces of Japanese culture were destroyed forever. It was the kind of systematic destruction that people still talk about with horror today. But here's what makes this so complex and troubling. Nobunaga genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. In his mind, these religious institutions represented everything that was holding Japan back from becoming a unified modern nation. They were obstacles to progress, centers of political resistance, and symbols of the old fragmented system that had kept Japan in chaos for so long. This brings us to one of the most difficult questions in all of history. When does progress justify violence? Nobunaga looked at Japan and saw a country that could be prosperous, unified, and strong, but only if the old power structures were completely swept away. He believed that the temporary brutality of destroying these institutions would lead to centuries of peace and prosperity for millions of people. From his perspective, every monk who died at Mount Hiei was a price worth paying to prevent the deaths of countless soldiers and civilians who would die in future wars if Japan remained divided. Every ancient temple that burned was worth sacrificing to build a modern nation that could defend itself and provide for its people. But the people who lived through these events saw something very different. They saw a man who was willing to commit acts of incredible cruelty to achieve his goals. Someone who seemed to have no respect for tradition, spirituality, or human life when they got in his way. The nickname, Demon of the 16th Century, wasn't just about his ruthlessness in battle. It was about his willingness to destroy things that other people considered sacred. What's particularly chilling is how calculated these actions were. This wasn't a case of a commander losing control in the heat of battle. Nobunaga made these decisions coldly and deliberately, and he never showed any public regret for them. When people criticized him for the destruction of Mount Hiei, He essentially said that anyone who opposed unification would meet the same fate. The psychological impact of these actions was enormous. Other religious institutions that might have opposed Nobunaga suddenly became much more cooperative. Local lords who might have resisted his authority decided that submission was preferable to destruction. In a very real sense, the terror he inspired became one of his most effective weapons. This pattern repeated itself throughout his career. When the Iko-Iki communities of armed Buddhist believers rose up against his rule, he responded with the same systematic brutality. When entire provinces resisted his authority, he didn't just defeat their armies, he often ordered the complete destruction of their communities as a warning to others. The question that haunts historians is whether Nobunaga was a visionary leader who understood that dramatic change sometimes requires dramatic action, or whether he was simply a brutal dictator who used the goal of unification to justify his own lust for power and control. What we do know is that his methods worked, at least in the short term. Japan did become unified, it did become more prosperous, and it did develop into a major world power. But the human cost of that transformation was enormous, and the precedent he set for using extreme violence to achieve political goals would echo through Japanese history for centuries to come. The man who had started as a clever underdog fighting impossible odds had become something much more complex and troubling, a leader who could bring both incredible progress and unimaginable suffering, often at the same time. So here we are at the end of our story, but in many ways Okehazama was just the beginning of something much larger. That young man who gambled everything on a storm-covered battlefield in 1560 went on to transform Japan in ways that are still felt today. The country that emerged from his vision was unrecognizable from the chaotic, fragmented land of warring clans that had existed before. But here's the thing about history. It rarely gives us the endings we expect. Nobunaga, the man who seemed unstoppable, who had defeated impossible odds and reshaped an entire nation, met his end not on a glorious battlefield, but through betrayal by someone he trusted. In 1582, one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned against him and forced Nobunaga to take his own life in a temple surrounded by flames. The irony is almost too perfect. The man who had burned so many temples, who had destroyed so many symbols of the old Japan, died in a temple fire himself. Some people saw it as divine justice, others as a tragic end to a brilliant life. But perhaps most importantly, his death proved that even the most powerful leaders are still human, still vulnerable to the basic emotions and conflicts that drive all of us. The question that haunts us when we look back at Nobunaga's life is whether it was all worth it. Did the unification of Japan justify the thousands of lives lost, the ancient traditions destroyed, the sacred places burned to the ground? Would Japan have found another path to unity and prosperity without all that bloodshed? We'll never know the answer to that question, but we do know this. The Japan that Nobunaga began to create eventually became one of the most successful and influential nations in the world. The emphasis on technology, trade, and merit-based advancement that he pioneered helped Japan become a major power that could compete with any nation on earth. His successors, Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu, completed the unification that Nobunaga had started, and they built upon the foundations he had laid. The peaceful, prosperous Japan of the Edo period, the rapid modernization of the Meiji era, even Japan's emergence as a modern industrial power in the 20th century, all of these developments can be traced back to the changes that began with that desperate gamble at Okehazama. But the human cost was real, and it's important that we don't forget that. Every time we celebrate Nobunaga's genius, we should also remember the people who suffered because of his choices. History is complicated that way. The same actions that bring progress to some can bring tragedy to others, and great leaders often leave behind legacies that are both inspiring and troubling. What makes Nobunaga's story so compelling is that it forces us to confront these difficult questions about leadership, progress, and the price of change. Was he a visionary who saw what Japan could become and had the courage to make it happen? Was he a ruthless dictator who used noble goals to justify terrible actions? Or was he simply a complex human being who, like all of us, was capable of both great good and great harm? The truth is probably all of these things at once. Nobunaga was a product of his time, but he was also someone who transcended his time. He was brilliant and cruel, innovative and destructive, inspiring and terrifying. In other words, he was human, but human on a scale that most of us can barely imagine. One thing is absolutely certain. Without Oda Nobunaga, without that impossible victory at Okehazama, without his willingness to break every rule and challenge every tradition, Japan would never have become the nation it is today. Whether that's ultimately a good thing or a bad thing depends on your perspective, but it's undeniably true. The storm that covered the battlefield at Okehazama on that day in 1560 changed everything. It swept away the old Japan and made room for something entirely new. And like all storms, it brought both destruction and renewal, both endings and beginnings. The boy who was willing to face impossible odds became the man who changed a nation forever. That's the legacy of Oda Nobunaga, and that's why we're still talking about him more than 400 years later. If you enjoyed diving into this incredible tale of ambition, strategy, and the complex nature of historical change, hit that like button and share this video with anyone who loves stories about the moments that shaped our world. Subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more epic tales from history's most fascinating periods, where we explore not just what happened, but why it matters and what it teaches us about ourselves. Until our next journey through time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember that history is always more complicated and more human than we first imagine.